Rec-
All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the very last material lecture of Data 100. This is exciting. I feel like you all deserve some kind of a prize for like persisting every lecture coming into the lecture. We have, I forgot how many people we have online. It was around like 70 something last I checked. But this is like very exciting. So before I jump into the content for today, I also want to make sure that you are all aware of this bonus opportunity. So it's that time of semester that we would like to get feedback from you. So always in every semester of Data 100, we keep improving the course and changing different elements of the course so that the course is serving you a little bit better and improves the students' experiences. And as such, we're always interested in getting feedback. So we are offering, as an incentive, we're offering an extra 0.5% towards your final credit. This is a big deal because now the bins are set, so you know that now this can actually change your final grade. Extra 0.5% if you fill out the campus's course evaluation as well as our internal course evaluation, which is also anonymous. Once you fill out both and the instruction is also on ed, you're going to be guaranteed to get an extra 0.5%. Additionally, if you're able to kind of persuade your friends to also fill out the course evaluation and the class reaches 90% response rate on both of the surveys, then the entire class is going to get an additional 0.5% extra credit. So total, there is a chance for you to get an extra 1% towards your final credit. And also it would benefit us because we're going to get good feedback and we'll keep improving the course because Professor Gonzalez and I are going to continue teaching in the fall. So we would like to see what are the things that we can improve and what are the things that actually worked out well and we should keep doing it as is. So without additional kind of logistics, we're going to dive into the clustering lecture. As I said, this is the last content lecture for Data 100. And I also want to make sure that we, again, put it out there that the first half of Data 100 was learning about the tools. So you learned about pandas, you learned about visualization, you learned about the techniques of doing exploratory data analysis. The second half, I like to think about it as it being like different modules and different pieces of a puzzle that you can use in the entire kind of training or machine learning life cycle that you'll see. And this is kind of the last piece of the puzzle that we're going to teach you in Data 100. Should you go and take additional courses 102, Data 102, CS 189, CS 188, or CS 182, you're going to basically be learning additional tools in that toolkit that you have. But clustering is really exciting. And I want to introduce kind of where clustering sits in this entire taxonomy of machine learning. We have all been seeing this kind of separation between two types of general types of learning that we have. Supervised learning categories and unsupervised learning categories. And we have seen all of them except for this last piece that we're going to see today. So what was supervised learning? Supervised learning was everything that we had labels for. We had the target variables in a vector of y that we were trying to use that in order to do some task or some estimation on a quantitative or categorical variable. So we had regression tasks that we learned through multiple linear regression lectures, and then we had the classification task that we learned through logistic regression, 2 lectures of logistic regression a few weeks back. In the unsupervised learning task, what we said was that we're going to not look at the labels either because we don't want the labels to influence any decision that we're making or that we don't have the labels. This is mostly happening when the data is really high dimensional and when labels are not available or the labels are noisy. And we had seen dimensionality reduction over the past week, principal component analysis. How can we get a high dimensional data and then reduce the dimensionality to the dimensions that are meaningful, that are capturing the maximum variance in the data, and we can use that. Today, I'm going to talk about clustering. So the idea is for us to take a look at the data and learn from the data. So either we can basically cluster the data into different categories or different clusters that we can have, or perform clustering so that we can use clustering as features that can then be used as in another pipeline of machine learning. So think about it as like a module that can fit in different places. Either you can use it as like an unsupervised learning algorithm by itself, or unsupervised learning algorithm that you're learning something from the data, that then you can use that as part of extracting features that you can use later on to learn better from the characteristics of the data. Anything that we learn in unsupervised learning is just learning from the data, right? So we look at the intrinsic kind of information in the data and the distribution of the data in order to figure out like what's the distribution and what kind of information we can gather from it. And today we're going to focus on clustering. Obviously, no lecture can goes by without the picture or an example of my cat. So this is like a first example of how we can do clustering, or like what clustering can be used for. You can imagine that my photos is like is full of like different pictures of my cat, her eyes and her paws and whatever. And I don't want to label different regions. Assume that I have different crops of her images, and I want to perform clustering. Those who are doing a computer vision project in the grad project aspect, graduate students, they are processing images. So you can imagine that these are images that you can extract some information from, you can reduce their dimensionality, and then you can do classification should you have labels. But if you don't have labels, you just need to operate on the feature space and use unsupervised learning algorithm in order to cluster them into different categories. And we're going to see how we can actually do clustering so that if features are good enough, things that are similar to each other are going to be in the same cluster and same category, that then we can assign kind of a pseudo label to those data points based on the category or the cluster that they belong to. I'm going to go over multiple examples kind of to tell you that where clustering can fit is in this entire pipeline. Clustering, the first example that I have is from the fall 2019 midterm 2 example. The data set, or this example that this data set was on, is based on patrons' visits at different 8 zoo exhibits. So there is like the time that they spend in different 8 zoo exhibits. So you can imagine that the data has originally 8 dimensions, so like the time that they spend in each one of the regions, and then assume that we've done PCA and the dimensionality is now reduced to 2 dimensions. So we have PC1 versus PC2 that's plotted there. Usually also, if we have a high dimensional data and we want to visualize the data, even if we don't want to do PCA in order to reduce dimensionality, we would do it anyways to visualize the data, to look at the trends. So let's assume that there is PC1 and PC2 that we extracted. And then what we want to do is we want to basically cluster the data so that we can identify if there are any characteristics depending on where users would fit in these areas that we can assign to the patrons, and then be able to understand what's going on in the underlying data. As you can see, there is no label assigned to any of these data points, and technically this is an unsupervised learning task. And what we're doing is we can basically perform our clustering algorithm, and then later on be able to cluster them into different categories, and then we can basically decide to assign kind of a pseudo label to each one of the categories, and we can say that, okay, this is my category 1 or cluster 1, this is cluster 2, and this is cluster 3. Okay, I'm hearing that the volume is low. Is it low? Let us know on a Slido. I feel like this should be the normal setting that we always had. All right, so moving on. Second example, you can imagine that with any kind of really online platforms that deals with any kind of recommender system or user preference data, you might want to imagine that any recommendation that needs to be made looks at users' characteristics, and then it looks at the inventory of anything that they have to recommend, right? For example, in the example of Netflix, you have different users that are watching different movies and TV series, and then you have also different categories of movies. There are 2 different places that you can do clustering without labeling users, because you can't go and label users that this user really likes to watch true crime movies, and this user always wants to watch, like, for example, drama movies. You can't label users in any kind of meaningful way, but what you can do is you can just look at the distribution of characteristics of all the users. Without labeling them, you can cluster them. And then you can say that, okay, there is this cluster of users that like 90% of the time they watch true crime movies, and then in 10% of the time they watch drama. Their characteristic is different. When I'm going to make a recommendation to them, I'm going to make similar recommendations, and then I'll take a look at what their preferences were in that specific cluster. In the same way, you can also go ahead and cluster movies based on different based on different characteristics, based on, for example, the shots, based on the lengths, based on the category, based on the actors and actresses in that movie and whatnot. And then you can create genres. You can see, like, if you, on Netflix or Tubi or anywhere, you scroll down, you see all of those genres. A lot of time, those genres are going to be dynamically created based on the user preferences and based on the match between user preference and also the categories of the movies. Obviously, we don't know how this recommendation system works on Netflix, but you can imagine that anything that deals with some inventory of things that are going to be recommended to a set of users that do have different preferences, there's kind of this two-tier clustering or modeling that is going to be done. I'm going to go also over another application. I just want to move this so that you can see. Details are not in scope. I'm just putting it out there so that you can see PCA can also be not the end goal that clustering can be just not the end goal. And sometimes like the end goal might change depending on the application that you have. This is actually a paper or a research project that went on in my lab, and it was basically on a data set that we collected from a course that I taught. So what was the course? The course was a machine learning course that I taught during COVID time. So students were taking the course online and whatnot. And we were trying to kind of make sure that the students have a community that they can study together, creating a study groups and whatnot. And the way that I was trying to enforce it was I broke down the entire class into groups of 10 students. And then I told each one of the groups that they have to meet over Zoom or however they want to do it, and then go over the lecture materials, and then create a one-page kind of a summary of what I taught them that specific week. So every 2 lectures, kind of, they were writing a summary. And then I was also asking groups to also submit a sample of problem sets. So these are the problem sets that they created so that they could also be used as part of the exam or the biweekly quizzes that we had in the course. There's also research in education that says that if the students are creating the assessment materials that they're going to be assessed on, then they're going to be engaged more in their learning, and there's like all improvement in the educational outcomes of a student. So that's why we had them to also write problem sets. So imagine that each group was submitting 2 documents weekly, but I didn't want to grade all of that. Like imagine that there's a large class and like every group is submitting like large documents weekly, 2 documents weekly that I didn't want to go over. How did I process it? I just wanted to make sure that groups are performing reasonably well, and they're basically doing the tasks that I told them that they're doing. So the way that we did this is, and you're going to learn more about this in tomorrow's lecture, which is going to be an LLM, that every piece of text that we have, there are ways that we can embed them into a numerical space. So like you have a sentence, you can transform that sentence into a vector. You have a word, you can transform it into a vector. You have like a paragraph, you can get embedding of that paragraph so that like when in that embedding space sentences are closer to each other, that means that the meaning of those sentences are close to each other. So that's what it means. So that's the first piece of kind of feature extraction or analysis that we have done. So all of these documents were weak. We passed it into a certain model that's called BERT. And this BERT was giving us the embedding of each one of those sentences. What did we do with those sentences? Imagine that, for example, there's 1 week that I was teaching logistic regression. All of those sentences, all of those vectors are represented in some kind of an embedding space. Each one of these points are like kind of representation of those sentences in this kind of embedding space. And what we did was clustering. But the clustering was not the end goal. I was trying to do clustering, and we'll show you an example of like of what those clusters look like. But I was doing the clustering in order to figure out what is the normal behavior, what should be the density of each one of the clusters, and what should be the contribution of each group in each one of those clusters, right? So it was part of my feature extraction step. So what I did was I extracted a bunch of features, 8 features per group, 8 features per component, using those clusters. What were those features? I was saying that, okay, if I have a cluster and I have, say, for example, 10 groups in the class, the contribution of each group to each one of the clusters should be 10% of the entire kind of number of points that I have in that cluster. So let's see what the percentage of contribution is, right? If the percentage of contribution is below 10% or above 10%, that is outside of like my expectation overall over the population. The other type of feature that I extracted was like, what is the ratio of the number of sentences that each group had for each one of those clusters? I just wanted to make sure that if, for example, there is a group that all their writing belongs to one cluster and they don't have any contribution to the rest of the clusters, I can also capture that, meaning that they didn't look at all the aspects of the things that we taught in the course. So 8 features for each one of them. We combined it together. So then each group, each submission for the group was represented by a 16-dimensional vector, 16 different features. And then what we did was we did some kind of a regression task that did the grade prediction, which was not the end goal. But the more important part was to do anomaly detection, to figure out which groups are outside of the distribution of the entire data, of the entire population of the class, so I can reach out to that group and then make sure that like either I can read their summary or I can meet with the students to see what's going on. This is like one way of identifying underperforming or overperforming groups in the class. How do you think that we did anomaly detection? You have seen that last week. We did PCA to 2 dimensions, and then reconstruction back to 16 dimensions. And we calculated the reconstruction error here between the time that we reduce the dimensionality and we increase the dimensionality. And the outlier groups are the ones that are going to basically have the highest reconstruction error. Those are the ones that are outside of the distribution for the data. That's why when we did the PCA, reduced it to 2 dimension, and then increased back to or reconstructed back to the original dimension, they're going to lose more information than other groups. So those groups were kind of labeled as anomaly, again, overperforming or underperforming group. So you can see that PCA was the last step, as opposed to being the feature kind of extraction piece. So this is like what I want to really make sure that you understand, that everything that we taught to you, like think about that as a tool and technique, and it can be used in different places. And a machine learning pipeline is just a really modular pipeline that you can decide how you want to like select every piece of it. And it can be an iterative approach. You can decide that, okay, I want to still do more feature engineering. Let's do clustering to see if I can get more features or not. So these are also nice clusters that we got for the logistic regression week. So for example, if you take a look at, say this gray cluster here, the center of this cluster is logistic function, is the time that the students were like explaining logistic function, and all of those representations are around the sentences that was describing the logistic function. Pretty cool stuff. Like education research or educational data mining or AI education can be really fun. And this is like one application that you can really now go ahead and do some similar project, because like I didn't do anything fancy or like out of the ordinary in the entire pipeline, and you can do similar projects as well. Next example is about gene expression and the conditions. This is not my work, obviously, but this is basically that if you have a bunch of conditions on the rows and you have genes on the columns, and if you do in this high dimensional space that you have a lot of genes and you have a lot of conditions, if you perform clustering, you should be able to figure out which conditions are more associated with a certain gene versus not. So for example, here you can see that there is a cluster of activated conditions corresponding to specific genes that, again, can be used here. As I said, clustering and PCA, sometimes they really go hand in hand. And a lot of time when the data set is high dimensional or the data set is large, we will kind of mix and match and use them in different places. This is an example that generally on genome data, on astronomy data, there is a lot of these kinds of techniques that are being used. This is also another example that you can see that is still the same thing. We have conditions, we have genes, and then if we cluster them together, then you would be able to figure out like what is the association of different genes and conditions with each other. If you want to read more about them, the links are there. I'm not going to spend the rest of the lecture explaining this biology kind of data to you. But let's go into the actual content, the actual fun part of things. Let's see what kind of clustering approaches exist and how we can actually do the task of clustering. So clustering generally is categorized into two types of algorithms. There's a lot of different types of clustering algorithms that you can use. They are divided into hierarchical approaches and partitional approaches. If you think about the partitional approach as the approach that you're assuming that your entire data set is one cluster and you're trying to make clusters and partition clusters out, that is one way of thinking about partitional approaches. Hierarchical approaches, on the other hand, are the categories that we're assuming that each data point is its own cluster, and you're going to merge them together and then keep creating larger and larger clusters up until the point that your entire data set is one cluster. So we're going to take a look at hierarchical approaches today, and we're going to take a look at some partitional approaches today. Particularly, we're only going to take a look at K-means clustering. Again, there is a whole different categories of partitional approaches that we're not going to go over it. For the purpose of Data 100, we're only going to see partitional approach of K-means clustering. So the algorithms that you'll see today are pretty fun and easy to understand. So what is K-means clustering? K comes from the fact that we need to decide ahead of time about what K we want to use. So K-means means that I want to create K clusters. So the way that the algorithm works is that we will assume that we decided already about the K, right? So I know how many clusters I want to have. And then we'll say that, okay, go ahead and randomly place K centers on your data set in the feature space. So assume that this is like my feature space, X and Y, two-dimensional space, pretty simple. I can go ahead and place two centers randomly on this entire feature space, right? These are randomly generated. Then the algorithm has two steps after this point, and you repeat these two steps until convergence. What is the first step? The first step says that color the points according to the closest center. So how did we color these points here? So here, for example, we said that, okay, for this specific data point, the distance of this specific data point to this cluster is this much, and then the distance to this other center is this much. So the shorter distance is the orange one, so we're going to give it a color orange. So that's how we colored everything, right? So the next step is kind of trivial after this. Once you have all of your points colored, center means that it has to be at the center. So you really need to now move your center to the actual center of these points, right? So if we are going back from this position, that this was a random placement of this center, then this center really needs to go to the center, and this center also needs to come to the actual center of blue points so that they are actual centers for us. So we'll do that. So obviously, because now I moved the centers, I might need to recolor some of the points. Some of the points might now be closer to the orange center as opposed to the blue center, especially, for example, some of the points at the center here or at the middle here, they were closer to blue before because like the center was here and the orange one was right here, and now they're now closer to the blue center. So we might have some recoloring as we go through this kind of loop of coloring and then moving centers and whatnot. So recoloring again, so we're in the first step. Now you're seeing that some of these points right here, they change color. So I want you to pay close attention to these 6 points right here. As I go through multiple different stages of this algorithm and I keep moving the centers and keep recoloring the stuff, those are going to gradually be absorbed into the orange cluster, and they're going to lose the blue color that they had, which they should, because they're closer to the. It looks like that this is like a big cluster of orange, and it should be like a small cluster of blue for us. So moving the centers, recoloring again, moving the centers, recoloring again. Now you see that all of those like 6 points that I highlighted for you, now they're all orange. But what's going to happen at this point? So we're in iteration 4. We have one blue point remaining, right? I'm at the step of recoloring stuff. So let's do recoloring and then see where we would end. This is after recoloring. Now we are at iteration 5. This is kind of the place that you would see convergence, right? Because your centers hasn't moved. Because the centers hasn't moved, none of the colors were changed. Since colors aren't changing, the centers are not going to change because the centers are still going to remain centered. So for 2 back-to-back iterations, if the colors are not changing or if the centers are the same, then the algorithm is going to converge. And this is the example or the step that this is going to happen. There's still this point right here that we're not satisfied with, that we're going to like really try different kinds of approaches to make sure that they get this point gets the right color. But this is the best that K-means clustering algorithm is going to give us, and we're done at this phase. Any questions so far? You've seen one algorithm, sweet and easy. It's not like complicated linear regression or logistic regression that I was teaching to you before. Now, like every algorithm is like quick. Yes. Can I answer that after the class? Thank you. Yes. That's a very good question. As I was saying it, I wanted to correct myself, but I didn't. So the centers, there is like the point that we were saying that would the centers move or would the colors change, right? So the center can still move slightly, but your colors might not change. So between iteration 4 and 5, we might have had like a small like change in the center location, but as long as the colors aren't changing, then iteration 6, we're not going to see any center movement because the colors are solid, and the color is the first step that we see. So that's where we would stop the algorithm. Very good question. Okay, let me move on. This is kind of a segue. For those who are coming from data 8, you've seen K nearest neighbors, and they both have K in their name, but they're not the same thing. They're not actually also sister algorithms. K nearest neighbors was a supervised learning algorithm, and it was used for classification. K-means clustering is an unsupervised learning algorithm, and it is used for like just clustering, and it's not used for classification, again, because we don't have the labels to fully classify things into different categories. The only thing that they have in common is K as a hyperparameter that you have to decide ahead of time. So that's the only thing that's in common. Again, for those who are coming from data 8, if you haven't heard about K nearest neighbors, just ignore this like past minute. So obviously, the next thing that I want to talk about every time that I talk to you about an algorithm, what was the next thing right immediately after that I talked to you about? Loss function. So like every time that you remember me with my models and my loss function, because like loss functions, we always need to have a way of objectively thinking about how good the model is. Like just looking at it visually is not going to do it, right? So I'm going to talk about like what is the loss function for K-means clustering, and like how can we minimize it, and if we actually in fact are able to minimize it or not. So let me show you an example with K equal to 4 on the same data set. Do you like this example? Is it a good clustering? Yes, no, sideways. This is not a good clustering. Like for one, K is not like an appropriate K. It looks like visually that this is 2 clusters. For us to go and do K equal to 4 is kind of giving us clusters that are not natural. But my main question for you is, if I go ahead and randomly initialize my starting points for all of those K clusters into different areas, I might end up with different final solutions. This is where my algorithm would converge. Say I use the random seed of 25, 29, and 40. Looking at these ones, which one do you think is better? First slide of the day. Do you think we have 200 audience? So I wait until 200. Let's see. Yes, we do. Okay, let's see. You all like A and then B and then C, which is kind of true. So I'm going to tell you why objectively we will arrive at the same answer, that A is the best and is also close to B, and B is second, and then C is not ideal. And again, if you take a look at this, C was not ideal because it had like a very sparse cluster, a sparse and a small cluster. So the size of the cluster here also matters for us. So how do we define a loss function that can objectively distinguish between A versus B versus C? And I want you to think about, for example, this example, this cluster when you're deciding about it. And specifically this point right here that is like, although it is closer to this center of cluster as opposed to this other center of cluster, but it looks like that it is close to the blue cluster as opposed to the actual red cluster that is creating. And it looks like that kind of cluster is a little bit sparse. So think about it. What are some good evaluation metrics that we can use in order to distinguish between these three options? And I'm going to let this go so that we can see your responses. L2, I like it that like every time that you see me, remember L2, L1. This time is close to L2, but it's like a different version of L2. Distance, how do I measure distance? Distance between cluster edges, that's a good one. Mean distance, summation of distances. I feel like we're kind of getting the point of how are we evaluating this kind of quality of the clusters and how kind of blobby the clusters are. So let's take a look at two metrics. The first metric that we're introducing is inertia. Inertia is going to basically calculate the squares of the distances of each one of the points to the center of the cluster that they're assigned to. So for example, here in this example, we're looking at all of these distances and we're squaring all of these distances and we're summing them up, and this is going to be our inertia, right? Obviously, what K-means clustering is doing is at every step, it tries to minimize inertia. Every time it tries to assign the point to the center or the cluster that it is closer to that point, and then it also moves the center to the center of all of the points to generally on aggregate minimize the sum of all of those square distances. I think by this point, I can ask, why am I squaring things and still I'm not leaving it as like the normal distance? Why are we scoring things? Can someone, yes? Penalize larger errors more. So that's the reason that we keep scoring stuff, right? Here, I didn't have a concern of the sign, that we did have the concern of the sign when we were looking at calculating losses for regression model, but here, same story. We're always interested in scoring losses so that we're scoring the distances so that we're penalizing larger deviations proportionally more than the smaller deviations. There is this other nice metric that I want you to think about that is distortion. The way that I want you to think about it is that if I have a large cluster, I want to give it some break. I can say that, okay, if you're a large cluster, it is expected that your data points are going to be more spread out. But if you're like a single point cluster or 2-point cluster, you should really be close to each other. And that was the main issue with option C that we saw previously here, because it was a small cluster, right? but it was very spread out. If you were calculating the squares of the distances to the center and then dividing it by the size of that cluster, it would be hugely penalized compared to, for example, the orange cluster or compared to the other clusters that we see. So think about that factor, the factor of the cluster size, also being something that we can consider. But in today's lecture, we're not going to think about distortion because everything that we did with K-means clustering was minimizing inertia. Again, both of the two steps were minimizing inertia for us. In fact, if I go ahead and calculate inertia for option A, B, and C, you would be able to see that A has the smallest inertia, then the next one is B, and then the worst case was option C. So kind of our intuition was also telling us the same thing. Okay, so now let's talk about this inertia thing and then see why were we getting different end results. Because I said that when I randomly reinitialize the initial points, I might land into final solutions that are different from each other, and I got option A, B, and C. So although K-means clustering is trying to minimize inertia, it fails to find the global minimum. This is an algorithm that is not guaranteed to reach to the global optimum for us. So we would say that K-means clustering, if you do random restart for sufficient amount of time, you would be able to get the global optimum. But every time that you're running the algorithm by itself, every run of the algorithm is not optimal. But it is good enough for us that we're using. And we're going to see why I say this is a good enough algorithm for us. So the reason that this algorithm is not optimum and is not going to be guaranteed to give us the minimum inertia is that it has a two-step process. And none of these two steps are actually taking the full control. There's one time that the first optimizer is holding the centers constant, and it's only reassigning the data points to different clusters. So it is only the second piece that's moving in this case, that the cluster assignment can change, but the centers will remain constant. And the second optimizer acts in a different way. It would say that you're not allowed to change the colors or the cluster assignment. You can just change the center. And because none of them is going to take full control, although like each one of them is thinking about optimizing inertia in a way, it's not going to an aggregate optimize inertia fully, right? So this is what we call, this is an algorithm that both of the steps that we're doing, they're local search, local optimization that we're doing. So we're making things incrementally better, but not so much better is so that like we can directly get the final global optimum. If you're interested in learning more about like local search algorithms, 188 is a really good course that you can take afterwards, because a lot of the things that we learned, gradient descent, also this way of running K-means, they all rely on solving a hard problem that we can solve it directly, but we will incrementally make it better. And we will run local search algorithms to actually do that for us. How do we actually find the optimum solution? Because there should be an optimum solution for anything, right? But it might be just computationally expensive. This is kind of a complicated CS concept. And for those who've taken CS 70 or 170, you might have seen this before, but I'm just going to briefly explain how, if you want to find the global optimum and you don't want to run this local search algorithm, how can you arrive at that? So I want you to think about this clustering algorithm that we're running as a coloring problem. So I have a bunch of points and I just want to color them, right? Because that's what it is at the end of the day. If you're thinking about each cluster as like a way of coloring different points that you have, you can assume that you have K colors, you have K clusters, and you're just going to color all of the data points. So one way to solve this problem is actually going ahead and consider all possible colorings that you can have for this entire data set. Because, for example, for data point 1, you have K options for the color. It can be like any of the colors of any of the clusters. For data point 2, you have K options. For data point 3, you have K options, and then all the way to data point N. And because you're considering all the options or all the coloring options for all of the n data points that you have k to the power of n number of coloring options. So one naive way of solving it is to just consider all of those possible colorings, k to the n, look at all of those individually, calculate inertia, right? Because once you have the colors, you can calculate the center of that color. Once you have the center of the color, you can calculate inertia, right? And then you can basically calculate inertia for all possible combinations that you have, right? And then the K coloring, or the coloring that had the minimum inertia, obviously is going to be the optimum solution for us. Why did I not do it, and why did I go through this entire like two-step K-means clustering algorithm? What's wrong with this? It is computationally expensive. It's if you take a look at the dimensionality of your data being n, so you have n samples, this is k to the n. This is exponential. So this is not a polynomial time algorithm. And because it's exponential runtime algorithm, we call this, and you can prove that this is an NP-hard problem that you can solve in polynomial time. And that's why for all of these hard problems, in the category of problems that we can solve them in polynomial time, we try to find a pseudo-optimal solution using local search algorithms. And this is the optimum way, pseudo-optimal way that we can arrive at reasonably good solution with like a few points misclassified or misclustered that uses kind of these two-step optimization that we talked about. All right, so now the kind of the entire K-means clustering, like why is not optimal, what's the way that you can make it optimum but know that it's computationally expensive, is done. Now I want to move on to the next kind of algorithm. Looking at these two plots, which one of them do you prefer? And the answer is hopefully obvious. So what we were getting from K-means clustering was option B, right? What if there is an algorithm that gives us option A? Would you prefer that or not? And I'm hearing yes. So let's take a look at which algorithm is actually going to give us that and how can we arrive at that point. So what we are basically going to think about is that what's the inertia on both of these graphs, right? So you can take a look at the left graph or option A having the inertia of 94, and the option B has the inertia of 87. So obviously K-means clustering is going to consider like optimizing the algorithm and is going to give us option B because it has a lower inertia, and that's the best case scenario for it. But it's not going to consider kind of the concept of blobbiness in our entire cluster, that we don't want this data point to hang basically right here, which is kind of going to be different from all of the neighboring kind of data points that it has, only because it is closer to the blue center as opposed to the orange center. So we're going to try to make sure that we use some neighborhood information that we're not using. Right now, we're only using the information of the distance to the center as opposed to the neighborhood information. And we'll see how we can change our local search algorithm that we can arrive at a solution that gives us option B, which is, sorry, option A, that is a better option. We promise you a 2 minutes break. Take a break. You can stretch, and then we'll come back in 2-3 minutes. So imagine that I have a bunch of points. This is two-dimensional space. And actually, let me explain this better. So I have all of these points right here that are on a line, right? And I have one point right here, right? If I do PCA and I reduce the dimensionality of this data set into one, this, like that line is going to be my intrinsic dimension, right? And then technically I'm gonna have a high reconstruction loss for that point that's not on the line, because when I basically reduce the dimension to one and then bring it back, this point is going to be projected into here. So it's gonna have that much loss versus like everyone else that's gonna have a low loss, right? So that's why, like, if you're out of the trend, you reduce the dimensionality and you reconstruct, you're losing information. For outliers, for the ones that are outside of the trend, there is high reconstruction error. Just the distance between the two 16-dimensional vectors, right? You have the original 16 dimension, you have the reconstructed one, you can calculate L2 norm as the distance between two vectors. Yeah, and you can also threshold it a little bit to figure out like, what is the threshold that I'm gonna say that this is an outlier? An outlier can be like overperforming or underperforming, both would be fine. Yeah. How I do it? Mm-hmm. Let me explain to that afterwards. Let me restart it. All right, so we are back. So now we saw K-means clustering. I feel like we're ready to move on to the next algorithm. That the next algorithm is actually going to use that neighborhood information that I wanted, right? So I said that the fact that it is like misclassifying or misclustering that single data point is that like it doesn't look at the neighborhood, but it just uses the information about the center. Like, who cares about the center if like the center is like a very big, or if the cluster is a big cluster versus another cluster that is a small. So we're gonna, in that case, take a look at the hierarchical approaches. And the reason that hierarchical approaches are going to look at the neighborhood is because I said with hierarchical approaches, we're thinking that each data point is its own cluster. Having n data points, you're assuming that you're starting with n different clusters, and then you will keep merging clusters that are closer together into building bigger and bigger and bigger clusters up until the point that you have enough clusters that you want, or like all the way you have only one big cluster, right? So that's why it uses that neighborhood information for us. There are three different kinds of criteria that we're going to use in order to like how to merge clusters. What's our criteria to merge clusters together and make like a slightly bigger cluster for us? The approach that we're going to talk about is called hierarchical agglomerative clustering. So we're assuming that, again, all of our data points are in different clusters. So here we are saying that every data point is in a separate cluster. We're starting with n different clusters, and we'll keep merging similar pairs of data points or clusters, similar clusters or similar data points that are in proximity of each other up until the point that we have one big cluster left, or up until the point that like, if you know like how many clusters you want and you reach that many clusters, because you will keep reducing the number of clusters by one at every step, then you will stop there, and those are the clusters that you will get at the end. And because of this, this algorithm is called a bottom-up approach or agglomerative approach that we're gonna see how it looks like. The criteria that we're going to use in order to measure the similarity of two clusters or similarity of the data points to each other is called linkage criteria. And we have three different linkage criteria that I'm going to go over. So first thing is called single linkage. In single linkage, the criteria that we're using is that we're saying that the distance between two clusters is the distance between their closest points, right? So it's as if that I have a cluster, and then as soon as like one data point is close to one of the data points in that cluster, no matter like where the rest of the data points are, these two clusters are going to be merged, or this point is going to be absorbed in that bigger cluster, right? We're looking at the most similar points in order to say whether this point should be absorbed in the cluster or not. So let's take a look at an example. So this is an example that I have 8 data points. I'm starting this algorithm with 8 different clusters. And then what's happening is I have to apply single linkage up until the point that I have one big cluster, right? So let's take a look at the single linkage. Single linkage should be pretty simple when we have like independent points. Like the distance of points from each other or every cluster here is just looking at these raw distances that I have here. So this is the distance to this point. This is the distance to this other point. The distance here, here, and then you can basically see that these are all the distances, right? So visually looking, the smallest distances are the distances between those pairs of points that are in the corners, right? The top two to the left, to the right, and the bottom two to the left and right. So what we'll do in the first step is we know that the smallest distance is going locally in the entire kind of landscape is going to be that I need to merge two of those points in one pair that I'm seeing on a graph, which is going to be merging into like getting this cluster. Now I have one cluster of 2 points and like 7 clusters of single points, right? So now I'm going to run basically single linkage again. So the single linkage between individual points is straightforward because it's basically what I calculated before. The distance between, for example, that point and anything else is just looking at these distances right here. Obviously, the closest location or the closest cluster to that point is like its neighbor. But what is the single linkage, or what is the distance of my cluster of 2 points with respect to the rest of them? It is the distance of the closest point in that cluster with respect to every other point. So what's happening here is like if I'm calculating the distance between this cluster and this data point, I'm looking at the closest point because I'm looking for like really absorbing it as soon as it gets close to one of my points, which is going to be the distance here. The distance between like this cluster and, for example, this point at the bottom is going to be the closest point's distance, which is going to be this vertical line as opposed to diagonal line, right? So it's going to be this line right here. And then calculating the distance between the pair and also this other point at the bottom is going to be, again, the same vertical line as opposed to the diagonal because this is a shorter distance. But looking at all of the distances, I can go and like show you all of those distances, but it looks like that is still merging those pairs is a better option because they're the closest to each other, just looking at the points locally, right? So what I'll do is I will go ahead and merge them, right? If you do the same kind of argument, you'll see that there is no smaller distance than these distances between the pairs. So I'll keep merging these ones up until the point that I have 4 clusters left. Now my task is a little bit harder. Now I need to calculate what's the single linkage distance between, for example, this cluster right here and this cluster right here. What do you think the distance is? Between the 2 points that are closest to each other, which are like the 2 middle points right here. So the distance here is this arrow right here, and then like the 2, if I'm looking at this cluster right here, what's this distance with the cluster at the top? Again, the vertical distances. So either it can be this distance or it can be this distance. They're going to be equal. The distance between, I think these two, we all agree that this is the distance that we're going to get. So I'm going to erase this so that it's a little bit cleaner. The distance between this top one right here and this bottom one right here is, again, like this vertical distance. And looking at them diagonally, the distance between like the 2 clusters on the diagonal is basically going to be the closest distance right here and the closest distance right here. Visually looking at those arrows, which one of those pairs are closer to each other? horizontal ones, right? So either I can merge the top two or the bottom two. So I'll merge the top two first with the same argument. You can see that it's still the bottom two are the closest to each other. And then you have only two clusters left that you will merge them into one big cluster. This is like the order that we're going to cluster all of the points up until the point that we have one big cluster. If we want to actually have three clusters, you just go back 3 steps or 2 steps, and then you'll get three clusters that you want. And this is like hierarchical agglomerative clustering with single linkage criteria that we can use in order to like locally merge the points. There's obviously, as I showed you, average linkage, which you can kind of by the name guess that it looks at the average similarity of all the points in one cluster versus all the other points in another cluster. Looks at the average. On average, if we're in agreement that we're close, we're close. If on average we're not in agreement, we're not going to let the closest ones decide. Because otherwise, if you're letting the closest ones decide, then your clusters are going to be basically white clusters, right? Probably there might be a case that you'll have white clusters. Then the next or the last criteria is complete linkage. Complete linkage says that let the worst case scenarios decide. Let the two extremes or the farthest points decide whether we're close or not. And therefore, you're calculating complete linkage between all the pairs. And in worst case scenario, if you have the shortest distance, then you're going to merge. So there's like worst case scenario, looking at the farthest points from each other. If across all of those distances, this is the smallest, these two clusters are going to be candidates that we're going to merge together. So let's take a look at an example. It's still at the level of having 8 different clusters and we want to keep merging them locally, still those pairs are going to be closest to each other, right? So I'm going to basically go ahead and look at merging these two to each other. And I want to show you that with complete linkage, situation is even going to be worse than the single linkage, because if I'm looking at the distance of, for example, this point or this cluster versus this cluster, as opposed to having this distance right here, I'm now looking at the distance being this distance. So the far points from each other are going to make a decision. So that's the distance of this cluster versus that cluster. The distance between this point and this cluster and this data point is the distance of like the farthest point to that data point. The distance between this data point is going to be the diagonal line. The distance here is also going to be diagonal line. The distance here is going to be this guy. The distance here is going to be this guy. So you can see that now my best case scenario is actually going to be calculating the distance between these 2 points, which obviously is larger than just looking at the distance between those 2 singleton clusters. So that's why we will not merge that cluster of 2 with any points, and we'll keep like combining all of those pairs up until the point that we're done with that like optimum small distance that we have. So we'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do this. And now we're at the step that we have to go from 4 clusters to 3 clusters. Think about it for a sec. Which one of the clusters are the next candidates for me to merge? I'm going to label them with 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, how many say 1 and 2? 1 and 2. How many say 1 and 3? 1 and 3. How many say 1 and 4? I'm only keeping 1 because like it's a symmetric kind of situation, so I can only like do 1 versus others. All right, so it looks like that 1 and 3 has the maximum. And I can show you why. So if I'm calculating the complete linkage distances between 1 and 3, it's going to be this distance. Between 1 and 2, I'm going to look at the distance between these 2 points at the far extremes. And 1 and 4 is even worse because I'm going to go diagonally, right? So that's why I'm going to merge 1 and 3. With the same reason, the next candidate is going to be 2 and 4. Then I have only 2 clusters. then I'll merge them and I'll get one big cluster. So this is how the single linkage criteria is going to help you decide what is the shape of the cluster that you want to create, and do you want to basically let the average decide, let the closest points decide, or let the farthest points decide. And based on that, you can locally keep optimizing and keep combining or merging the data points or clusters together up until the point that you have a big cluster remaining at the end. So now let me show you another example. So we're going to iteratively run this bottom-up approach in order to merge different points together and then start reducing the number of clusters we have. So I have 12 points here, right? Labeled starting from 0 all the way to 11. So those are my cluster labels. Initially, I'm starting with like 12 different clusters. What do you think my first merge option is going to be? Assume that I'm going to use complete linkage that's in the title. Look at the distances. So my guess is that I feel like these 2 points are the closest to each other. Some of these, like the differences or the distances are hard to see visually, but like 10 and 11 is kind of clear that they're the smallest distance, and I think the next candidate is going to be 5 and 1. Then we're going to move on and then see if like 0 and 4 are close to each other or not. But this is kind of the order of distances that I can visually see, which we can do. We can combine 10 and 11. We will label it with the cluster 10. So both of them with 10, so we know that they belong to the same cluster. Now I have one cluster of 2 points, and then I believe I have 10 different singleton clusters remaining. I said the next candidate is 1 and 5, but I feel like 0 and 4, based on the actual calculation, is going to be closest. So we're going to move on to merging 0 and 4 with each other. Now I have one cluster of zeros. So they're both belong to the same cluster. What am I going to do next? So the next thing that we're going to do, again, in this case, I have 2 clusters of 2 points, and then I have 8 different clusters with like single point or singleton clusters that I have on the plot. So the next thing that we can do is we can take a look at what's happening in the proximity of the area that we were wondering what the distance is, or whether they're close to each other or not. So looking at the distance of the data point with label 3 and the cluster of 1, if I want to calculate the distance, what I can do is I can basically calculate the complete linkage. I can say that the distance of 3 to the cluster of 1 is the longest distance that it's going to have. And that's the distance with the bottom 0 that we'll get. We can also argue exactly the same thing with respect to the cluster of 10 and, for example, cluster of 5, or cluster of 10 versus the cluster of 1. So for example, the distance between this cluster of 10 and 5 is going to be this longer distance, right? Because we're working with the complete linkage. But if you're looking at all of the distances and calculate them, what do you think the next candidate is going to be? 5 and 1, yes. We visually kind of saw that 5 and 1 is going to be the next cluster. We're going to merge them together. Now we have 2 clusters close together at the bottom, and then we have also a bunch of points and like one cluster right here. So looking at now the distances, let's see what our next options are going to be. So now the distance between the cluster of 1 and cluster of 10 is what? I think the distance is going to be this distance right here from the far points in the cluster 1 and in the cluster 10. The distance between cluster 10 and anything else is going to be larger. So I'm not going to calculate that because we're always looking for the most similar clusters with each other. Same thing with cluster 1. If I'm calculating the distance of cluster 1 to any other cluster, it's going to be larger than the distance that it has with cluster 10. That's why that's the only option, immediate option, that those 2 clusters are going to get if they're going to get merged. Now looking at 6 and 8, this is like the distance that they had. But again, cluster 6 is not going to be merged into any other cluster other than 8, because 8 is the closest cluster. If I sort them, it has to be merged first with something that deals with 8, or the cluster that 8 is going to belong to, and then it's going to be basically looking at everything else. I think same thing goes for 8. 8 is closer to 6 as opposed to 3 or 0, so that's where that goes. For the cluster 3 and 0, this is the distance that we're dealing with. With 7 and 9, this is the distance that we're going to have. Again, 9 is closer to 7 as opposed to 0 or 3 or anything else. That's why, again, I'm just showing that. What is the closest cluster to 2? 2 is closest to 7, right? And then anything else is going to be larger. So looking at all of these options, now what do you think the next option is going to be for us? The next option for us is going to be 7 and 9. So we're going to merge 7 and 9. I'm going to go back here. Just take a look. It's kind of a close tie, and it's hard to distinguish between them, whether 6 and 8 is closer or 7 and 9, but 7 and 9 is closer, so we're going to merge them together. Now we're basically dealing with the similar situation. If I show you all of those complete linkage criteria, then you will see that, okay, the next option is going to be this cluster of 6 and 8. That was our next candidate that we had to combine. Again, if I go back here, this is my drawing. You could basically see that the order should have been 7 and 9, and then 6 and 8. Then we will see what happens in the dynamic at that center and whether like the linkage order is going to change or not. So then we did 7 and 9, we did 6 and 8. Now we're at this point. So what are our complete linkage orders in this case for us? So what we're saying is that we can now go ahead and go to our third option and combine the cluster of 3 and the cluster of 0. So we go ahead and combine them. Now we have a cluster of 0, cluster of 7, and cluster of 6. So what do you think I should do next? Obviously, 2 is far away. I have 2 clusters that are relatively close to each other in that corner, cluster of 1 and cluster of 10. And there's all of those bunch of distances that I'm dealing with between 0, 7, and 6. In fact, if I take a look at the distance between 0 and 6, the distance is actually the distance between these points, right? And if I'm looking at the distance between 7 and 0, what are the 4 points from each other? I think this is the distance, right? But what is the distance between 1 and 10? That's closer. So our next option is going to be just merge 1 and 10. Now I have a big cluster right there. Now in this case, I'm going to move on to merging one of those 3 or 2 of those 3 clusters that I have at the center, 0, 6, and 7. And if we look at the differences, you would see that the blue line is a little bit shorter than the gold line. Again, it's hard to see visually, but since blue line is shorter than the gold line, I'm going to merge 0 and 7 to each other. So why am I not concerned with any other cluster? Because their distances are larger, right? So the distance of cluster 1 with cluster 6 is this large line. Which is this long line, which is like way longer than the blue line and also the gold line. So that's why I'm not concerned with anything else, and I was paying attention to what's happening at that center. So we're going to combine them. So what do we do next? Now we have 3 clusters right here, cluster of 1, 6, 0, and 2. And now I'm going to look at the distances one more time with you. So I think 2 has the longest distance here. With 0, it has even a longer distance with anything else. So I'm not going to go through that route. The distance between 0 and 6 is probably going to be this distance right here. And then the distance between 1 and 6 is going to be this line right here. So I think visually is kind of clear what the next option should be. The next option is going to be merging 0 and 6. Which we're going to do. And now we have 3 clusters. We calculated again. Now 2 is going to be absorbed into the cluster of 0. Now I have 1 big cluster of 0. Now I have also another small cluster of 1, which is exactly what we wanted since the beginning. Since the beginning, we had issue with this like single point right here. but we changed our algorithm so that instead of looking at the centers, we're looking at the proximity of the points so that we can keep like merging points that are close to each other into one cluster up until the point that we have nicely kind of shaped and formatted clusters for us. Question? The question is, if you want K clusters, what would you do? Either you can stop it at K or you can create all the way and then walk back, which I'm going to show you what walking back is going to look like. Walking back looks like this on the dendrogram. So the tree that you see is called dendrogram that is going to be created together with the clusters that you're creating. So it shows the order in which all of the data points are merged together up until the point that there is one big cluster at the top. So all of the data points are here at the bottom here, and then it will basically show you what was the order of merging those data points, and then you will basically see the size of each one of like these larger clusters and all the way up until this point that you have a single cluster. The only thing that you need to do is like once you build the dendrogram, you just break it down and then go down K steps or K minus 1 steps up until the point that you have K clusters. This is kind of another nice visual that will show you like how the clustering is created and then how you can kind of understand this entire process end to end. The code for you to be able to get the dendrogram is also in the lecture demo, but we're not going to ask you to reproduce dendrogram on the exam. This is just for you to understand it. Okay, second algorithm done. I just want to now talk a little bit about this picking K, or how do I pick this hyperparameter K so that I know how many clusters is enough? Because that's still a concern that I had with K-means clustering, and it's still a concern that I have with hierarchical approach because I still need to know like how many clusters do I need to have and when to stop the algorithm. So there is like 4 different ways for us to decide how we want to do it. There's one way that like you do EDA, you take a look at your data, or you look at like what your data should represent kind of based on your intuition, and then you decide how many clusters you want to have. This is the map of the USA, so you can kind of decide how you want to split it, how many regions you want to split it to, like East Coast, West Coast, things like that. And then you basically run with that K based on your intuition from the EDA step that you have. The second approach is going to be similar to what we had in PCA. Remember a script plot in PCA? This is kind of a similar plot. What you can do is you can say that, okay, I'm going to go ahead and try a bunch of different Ks. In PCA, you were trying different principal components, and then you were looking at the variation, and then like at what point do you see diminishing return? It's also the same thing here. We're going to say that, okay, we had a bunch of objective functions. We had like inertia. We had also distortion. So what if I go ahead and run my best case scenario for different Ks and calculate my inertia or calculate my distortion, and then look at like at what point if I increase K, then I will see diminishing return that I should stop and I should not continue. This is called elbow method. Probably we didn't use the term elbow method in PCA, but it's exactly the same thing. It's the elbow of this plot that we're going to use as the point, as the optimum point for what is the optimum K. In this case, probably like 2 or 3, either should be fine. And based on the data, you know that 2 was the optimum because we had actual visually like 2 different clusters that we could see. Now, the third approach is like a metric that we can calculate. And this metric is called silhouette score. It's a score that we're assigning to each individual point about like how happy that point is. And I'll explain to you what like happiness of a point actually means. And what we're interested in is on average, we want to calculate all of these happiness scores or all of these silhouette scores. And then we would say that, okay, for different K values, what was the average silhouette score? And then we'll pick the K that has the optimal silhouette scores that we have. So when I refer to happiness, let's take a look at this point right here. This point right here, although visually we can see that it is clustered into a reasonably good cluster or relevant cluster, it's not happy because with different algorithms, it's going to be misclassified. part of the reason that it's going to be misclassified is that generally it is far from the rest of the data points in its own cluster, and it is close enough to the rest, to the second cluster or the nearest cluster, that is going to lead to sometimes having it misclustered or misclassified, right? So this is kind of the thing that we want to calculate. We want each point to be in its own community, in its own cluster, and we want that community or that cluster to be far away from the second cluster so that the kind of the confusion is going to be reduced. So there are two things that we're calculating. And obviously, when I'm talking about same cluster and opposing cluster, I'm looking at it on average. So the silhouette score for every point is calculated using two values. The value A basically says that what's your average distance to the other points in the same cluster. So for this data point that I keep talking about is going to be the average of the data point to, for example, the distance of this data point to this point, this point, this point, and all of these points. I'm calculating all the distances, and then I'll calculate the average. So this is like how well you are within the cluster that you're in. But then I also mentioned that we're interested in the point to be far from the confusing cluster or the closest cluster that might happen here, which in this case, I would say that, okay, I'm going to calculate the average distance of this point with every other point that is in the closest cluster to this point that I have, right? And then what I'll do is I'll say that, okay, B is the average distance of the point to the closest cluster. So how do I use this information so that that point is going to have a lowest score? I want to penalize the distance I want to penalize having low distance to the neighboring cluster, and I want to emphasize that I want to have a low distance to the data points in your own cluster. So I can do it with this equation, and it will make sense because the silhouette score tells that let's calculate B minus A. What was B? B was the average distance to the other cluster, right? So if the average distance to the other cluster is small, B is going to be small. And that's where you're going to be penalizing. You're going to have a low silhouette score. On top of that, you're going to say that, okay, whatever your A is, whatever your average distance to the data points in your own cluster is, I'm going to subtract it so that you're incentivized to reduce A down to 0. So all of the points are on top of each other, right? If you have a high average distance to the data points in your own category, I'm going to penalize it. And then you're dividing it by the maximum. And then this is your silhouette score. So thinking about what silhouette score actually is, because we're a little bit over time, we're close to time, not over time. I'm just going to tell you that the highest value that the silhouette score can be is actually 1. That is going to happen when either A is equal to 0, all of the data points in the same cluster are on top of each other, or the data point that we have is really far away from the second cluster. So in that case, then this fraction is going to be equal to 1. This silhouette score can also be negative. It can be negative because in the case that this data point, for example, in this specific case, this data point is closer to this, on average, to the opposing cluster as opposed to this cluster, then B minus A is going to be negative, so silhouette score can be negative. How do we use this information? We can use this information using a silhouette plot. Silhouette plot actually plots the distribution of what's happening with the silhouette scores in each cluster. So what's happening here is that if you take a look at the blue cluster, it is going to tell you that, okay, I'm going to take a look at all of the silhouette scores for all of these data points, all of the data points here, right? I will sort them, and I will calculate for every given data point what the silhouette score is, and I'm going to show it by this curve right here. And the width of the curve is actually showing you how many data points you have. So we have like a wider blue cluster because we have more data points in the blue cluster as opposed to the orange cluster. You can also see that these are all of the silhouette scores for the orange cluster. You can see that on average they're higher because they're better clustered with each other. And we can also calculate this vertical line right here, which is the average of all of the silhouette scores. So how do we make a decision finally? We can just go ahead and try for different K values, for K equal to 2, for K equal to 3. We can take a look at the silhouette plots. We can take a look at the average silhouette scores that we're getting. And in this case, you're seeing that K equal to 2 has a better average silhouette score and like better performance on each one of those clusters individually, as opposed to when we have 3 clusters and looking at the silhouette plot that way. There's also one last final way of doing it, which is kind of using additional information of the application that you're working with. Say, for example, you have a production line for T-shirts, and you want to decide based on the profit and whatnot, do you want to have 3 T-shirt sizes or 5 T-shirt sizes, right? So based on that application, it doesn't make sense for you to go and take a look at K equal to 4, because like you're not going to have 4 different T-shirt sizes. For the options that you have, what you can do is you can do clustering with K equal to 3, go with the small, medium, large, or you can go with K equal to 5, go extra small, small, medium, large, and extra large, and then do the clustering, do the profit analysis, and then figure out which type of clustering is going to give you maximum profit, and you go with that option. So I'm going to skip this summary here, or quickly kind of saying that we covered K-means clustering. We have seen that K-means clustering is kind of a local search approach that is kind of a partitional approach. We also saw hierarchical approach, which is a bottom-up agglomerative approach. We have seen different kinds of linkage criteria. And that was a wrap for clustering. We're going to see you back on Thursday. This was the last content lecture. On Thursday, we're going to basically do a conclusion of Data 100. What you have seen so far, what you're going to see on final, what are the next courses that you should take, what did we not cover, and where you can find them. And then we're going to also have a short introduction on large language models and how you can understand large language models better with your current understanding in Data 100. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you back on Thursday.